The dust-choked summer air hung like a shroud over Eliza O'Malley as she stepped down from the stagecoach, her threadbare carpetbag clutched against her chest like a shield. Fort Stanton, New Mexico Territory, 1878, end of the line for a woman with nowhere else to run. Whispers followed her like shadows as she made her way down the main street, eyes downcast, the scarlet letter of her past almost visible to anyone who cared to look close enough. Another one of those fallen women, a shopkeeper's wife muttered, pulling her children closer as Eliza passed by. "Mark my words, she'll bring nothing but trouble to Fort Stanton." Eliza's cheeks burned, but she kept walking. The scandal that had driven her from Boston still clung to her like perfume, the wealthy married banker who had promised love, the child lost before it could draw breath, the public humiliation that followed when his wife discovered their affair. Society had a punishment for women like her, and Eliza had been forced to drink that bitter cup to its dregs. Fort Stanton hadn't been her first choice. It wasn't anyone's first choice. But the frontier town nestled in the shadow of the Sacramento Mountains was far enough from civilization that she might start again, if such a thing were possible for someone carrying shame as heavy as hers. Samuel Zimmerman didn't notice the newcomer at first. He was too busy trying to calm his temperamental stallion, Diablo, who had taken exception to a fluttering newspaper blown across the street. At 30 years old, Samuel had spent enough time with horses to know when one was genuinely spooked and when one was simply being difficult. Diablo fell firmly into the latter category. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice low and steady as he stroked the horse's neck. "You've seen worse than paper, you ornery beast." It was only after he'd gotten Diablo settled that he spotted her, a slender woman in a travel-worn dress that had once been fine, but now showed signs of careful mending. Something about her solitary figure, shoulders hunched against the weight of unseen burdens, caught his attention. Fort Stanton wasn't large enough to miss the arrival of someone new, especially not someone who walked like they were expecting a blow. Samuel tied Diablo to the hitching post outside the general store and adjusted his hat. As foreman of the Circle Z ranch, he had business in town, supplies to order, mail to collect, ranch hands' wages to deposit. But suddenly none of it seemed as pressing as finding out who this stranger might be. He watched as she approached the hotel, hesitating before climbing the steps. Her pause gave the desk clerk enough time to step outside, arms folded across his chest. "We don't have any vacancies, madam," the man said, loud enough for half the street to hear. Samuel frowned. The Fort Stanton Hotel rarely filled all its rooms, even during cattle season. "Please," the woman's voice carried, soft but determined. "I can pay. I just need somewhere to stay until I can find work. Like I said, no vacancies. Try Johnson's boarding house down by the livery, though I doubt Widow Johnson will be any more accommodating." The clerk's meaning was clear. Word traveled fast in small towns, and someone had already passed judgment on this woman. Samuel stepped forward before he could think better of it. "Martin," he called to the clerk, "I believe Mr. Hayes asked you to hold a room for one of our business associates from Santa Fe. Don't think he'll be arriving after all. Perhaps the lady could take that room instead." Martin's face pinched with displeasure, but Samuel Zimmerman wasn't a man to be crossed lightly. The Circle Z was the largest ranch in the area, and Hayes Mercantile didn't stay in business by turning away their custom. "I suppose that might be arranged," Martin conceded, though his expression suggested he'd bitten into something sour. The woman turned, and Samuel got his first proper look at her face. Despite the dust of travel and evident exhaustion, she was beautiful, not in the painted, showy way of saloon girls, but with a quiet dignity that suffering had failed to diminish. Her eyes, A deep green that reminded him of the mountain forests after spring rain widened slightly at his intervention. "Thank you, sir, but I wouldn't want to cause any trouble," she said, her accent betraying Eastern origins. "No trouble at all, madam. Samuel Zimmerman." He touched the brim of his hat. "Foreman at Circle Z Ranch, Eliza O'Malley." She offered her name hesitantly, as if unsure whether she should even claim it. "Welcome to Fort Stanton, Miss O'Malley. Or is it Mrs.?" "Miss," she replied, a flicker of something pain perhaps crossing her features. Martin cleared his throat pointedly. "Will you be wanting that room or not?" Eliza straightened her shoulders. "Yes, thank you. I can pay for a week in advance." Samuel watched as she followed the reluctant clerk inside, wondering what circumstances had driven a clearly educated Eastern woman to a dusty New Mexico outpost with nothing but a single carpet bag and a shadow hanging over her reputation. He completed his errands methodically, but found his thoughts returning to Eliza O'Malley. Fort Stanton wasn't known for its charity toward outsiders, particularly women traveling alone. He'd seen how quickly the town could turn on those it deemed morally suspect. By the time Samuel had loaded his supplies and collected the mail, the afternoon was waning. He was about to mount Diablo when he spotted Eliza again, emerging from the hotel with a determined set to her jaw. She was headed toward the business district, where the town's few establishments clustered along the main street. Curiosity got the better of him. He led Diablo slowly down the street, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough to intervene if needed. He watched as she entered Hartwell's Dry Goods, only to emerge minutes later, her expression more strained than before. The same scene repeated at Peterson's Cafe, the small print shop, and even the schoolhouse, where the door closed firmly in her face before she could step inside. It was becoming clear what was happening. Someone had made sure the town knew to turn her away. Samuel tied Diablo outside the telegraph office and stepped inside just as Eliza was leaving, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "No luck?" he asked gently. She startled, then composed herself with visible effort. "It seems Fort Stanton has no need for additional help anywhere. How fortunate for the town to be so prosperous." The bitter edge to her words suggested she understood exactly what was happening. "People here can be suspicious of newcomers," he offered, though they both knew it was more than that. "People everywhere can be suspicious of women with certain reputations, Mr. Zimmerman." She lifted her chin. "Even when they know nothing of the truth." Samuel studied her for a moment. "The Circle Z could use someone to help with the house. Mrs. Henderson, our housekeeper, has been complaining about needing an assistant. Can you cook? Keep accounts?" Hope flashed in her eyes before suspicion replaced it. "Why would you help me? You know nothing about me." "I know enough to see someone who deserves a fair chance," he shrugged. "Besides, Mrs. Henderson is 72 and stubborn as a mule. Anyone who can manage her will have earned their keep twice over." A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, the first he'd seen. It transformed her face, hinting at the woman she might have been before whatever troubles had driven her west. "I can cook, clean, and manage household accounts," she said. "I was trained to run a proper Boston household. Boston's a long way from Fort Stanton." "That was rather the point, Mr. Zimmerman," he nodded, respecting her reluctance to elaborate. "The ranch is 10 miles north. Stage makes the run twice weekly, but I can have someone bring a wagon for you tomorrow if you'd like to consider the position." Eliza glanced back toward the hotel, then down the street where curious eyes watched their interaction. "I think I would prefer not to wait, if it's all the same to you. I can be ready to leave within the hour." Samuel recognized the urgency in her voice. One night in a town that had already decided what kind of woman she was would be one night too many. "I'll arrange for a wagon," he said. Meet me at the livery stable in an hour. Relief softened her features. Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman. Samuel, he corrected. If you're going to be working at the Circle Z, we don't stand on formality. Samuel, she repeated, and he found himself unreasonably pleased by the sound of his name on her lips. True to her word, Eliza was waiting at the livery when Samuel arrived with a light wagon an hour later. Her carpetbag and a newly purchased bundle likely containing basic necessities sat beside her. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the town. "You travel light," he observed as he helped her into the wagon. "I left in a hurry," she replied simply. Samuel didn't press for details. Everyone in the West had a past they'd rather not discuss. It was one of the unspoken courtesies of frontier life to allow people their secrets, at least until they chose to share them. As they left Fort Stanton behind, Eliza seemed to breathe easier. The road wound through pinyon pines and juniper, climbing gradually into the foothills where the Circle Z spread across thousands of acres. The landscape opened up, revealing a vastness that made human troubles seem smaller by comparison. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, looking out at the mountains painted gold by the setting sun. "Different from Boston, I imagine, in every possible way." There was no regret in her voice, only wonder. They crested a hill, and the ranch came into view, a sprawling main house built of local stone and timber. A bunkhouse, barns, corrals, and outbuildings arranged in a practical pattern that spoke of careful planning. A creek ran along one side, lined with cottonwoods whose leaves flashed silver in the breeze. Circle Z was built by Mr. Hayes's father 30 years ago, Samuel explained. Started with nothing but a dream and some stolen Mexican cattle, if the old-timers are to be believed. Now it's one of the largest spreads in the territory. "And where is Mr. Hayes?" Eliza asked. "Denver, most likely, or maybe Santa Fe. He spends most of his time on business matters, leaves the running of the ranch to me." Samuel guided the wagon toward the main house. "You'll meet him eventually. He comes back every few months to check the books and remind everyone who owns the place. And you don't mind being left in charge without being the owner?" Samuel considered her question. "I've been foreman for 8 years. Before that, I was just another cowhand. Mr. Hayes gave me a chance to prove myself when others wouldn't. The Circle Z is as much home as I've ever had." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I hope I can earn my place here as well." "You will," he said with more conviction than was perhaps warranted for someone he'd just met. But something told him Eliza O'Malley was not a woman who failed at what she set her mind to. Mrs. Henderson met them at the door, her lined face creased with suspicion as she assessed the newcomer. The elderly housekeeper had been with the Hayes family since before Samuel's time, and she guarded her domain jealously. "So this is your solution, Mr. Zimmerman?" she asked, hands on her hips. "Some city girl who's never seen the business end of a mop, Mrs. Henderson. This is Miss O'Malley," Samuel said, ignoring the older woman's tone. "She'll be assisting you with the household duties as we discussed." "We discussed finding someone suitable," Mrs. Henderson sniffed, "not picking up strays from town." Eliza stepped forward, her posture straight but not challenging. "I understand your concerns, Mrs. Henderson. I may not be familiar with ranch life, but I assure you I know how to work. I'm a quick learner and I won't disappoint you." The old woman's eyes narrowed, taking in Eliza's worn but well-made dress, her carefully pinned hair, the way she held herself. "We'll see about that," she finally said. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Mend?" "Certainly." "Handle accounts and correspondence?" "I was educated at Miss Porter's school in Connecticut." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Well, aren't you fancy? Education won't help much when you're up to your elbows in bread dough or scrubbing floors. Perhaps not, Eliza conceded. But I'm not afraid of hard work, and I suspect you're not a woman who suffers fools gladly. You won't need to teach me twice. A gleam of approval flickered in the housekeeper's eyes. Get her settled in the small room off the kitchen, she told Samuel. She starts at dawn tomorrow. We'll see what she's made of. It was as close to acceptance as could be expected from Mrs. Henderson. Samuel hid his smile as he carried Eliza's meager belongings to the room in question, a modest space, but clean and private, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window that looked out toward the mountains. It's not much, he apologized. It's perfect, Eliza said, and there was such genuine gratitude in her voice that Samuel felt a pang in his chest. What kind of life had she left behind that made this simple room seem like a palace? Mrs. Henderson's bark is worse than her bite, he assured her. Mostly. That small smile appeared again, brightening her eyes. I'm used to difficult women, Mr. Zimmerman. Samuel. Boston society specializes in them. Well, I'll leave you to get settled. Supper's at 6 in the kitchen. The ranch hands eat in the bunkhouse, but you'll take meals with Mrs. Henderson here in the main house. Thank you for everything. She said it simply, but the weight behind her words was unmistakable. Samuel nodded, suddenly uncomfortable with her gratitude. You'll earn your keep, I've no doubt. Get some rest, Miss O'Malley. Eliza, she corrected him. If we don't stand on formality at Circle Z. Eliza, he repeated, tipping his hat before leaving her to unpack her new life. The ranch's rhythm absorbed Eliza quickly. Within days, she had established herself as indispensable, rising before dawn to help prepare breakfast, managing the laundry with efficient grace, and taking over the household accounts with a precision that even Mrs. Henderson grudgingly admired. If the old housekeeper noticed how often Samuel found reasons to visit the main house, she kept her observations to herself. For his part, Samuel told himself his interest was purely professional, ensuring a new employee was settling in properly. But he couldn't deny the way his day brightened when he caught glimpses of Eliza hanging laundry in the yard, her hair coming loose from its pins in the breeze, or the evenings when he'd linger over coffee in the kitchen while she recorded expenses in the ledger. Gradually, the wariness in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a cautious contentment. She was still reserved, still careful about what she revealed of her past, but the shadows that had followed her from the stagecoach seemed less oppressive. 2 weeks after her arrival, Samuel found her sitting on the porch after supper, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. He hesitated, then joined her, offering the coffee he'd brought from the kitchen. "Thank you," she said, accepting the steaming cup. "It's beautiful here at night." He followed her gaze to where stars were beginning to appear above the mountains, different from city lights. Better. She took a sip of coffee. In Boston, even the stars felt constrained by convention. Samuel chuckled. "Can't say I've spent much time in cities to compare. You haven't missed much." Her tone was light, but he heard the undercurrent of pain. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch horses nickering in the corral, the distant lowing of cattle, coyotes calling to each other in the hills. "Mrs. Henderson says you're the most capable assistant she's ever had," Samuel finally said. "Coming from her, that's high praise indeed." Eliza looked surprised. "She told you that?" "Not in so many words. She said you might not be entirely useless after all, which is practically a declaration of undying affection." Her laugh was unexpected and lovely, like music in the quiet evening. "She's teaching me to make sourdough bread tomorrow. I believe that's the final test of my worthiness. You seem to have passed all her other trials with flying colors." I've had practice at proving myself." There was that shadow again, briefly darkening her expression. Samuel hesitated, then decided to take a risk. "Eliza, I don't mean to pry, but what happened in Fort Stanton? Why was everyone so quick to turn you away?" She stiffened slightly, her fingers tightening around her cup. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer, or worse, that she'd retreat behind the walls she'd begun to lower. "Word travels faster than stage coaches," she finally said. "My indiscretion in Boston was reported in the newspapers. Apparently, the scandal was significant enough that it reached even here." She gave a bitter laugh. "The banker's wife made certain of that. She wanted to ensure I could never show my face in respectable society again." Banker's wife. Eliza took a deep breath. "I was engaged to a man I thought I loved. When he broke our engagement to pursue a more advantageous match, I was heartbroken. Then I met Edward Blackburn, who showed me kindness when I most needed it. He was charming, sophisticated, and married, though he neglected to mention that fact until I was already in too deep." She paused, staring into her coffee as if it might contain answers. "When I discovered the truth, I tried to end things, but he convinced me his marriage was in name only, that he would leave his wife once certain business matters were settled. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. By then I was." She hesitated. "I was carrying his child." Samuel kept his expression carefully neutral, though anger stirred within him at the man who had taken advantage of her vulnerability. "When his wife discovered our affair, Edward denied everything. Claimed I had pursued him, that I was trying to trap him for his money. Society chose to believe the respected banker over the jilted spinster." Her voice grew quieter. "I lost the baby during the height of the scandal. After that, there was nothing left for me in Boston. My family disowned me, my friends abandoned me, so I came west, hoping to outrun my shame." "Only to find it had arrived before you," Samuel said softly. She nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Now you know what kind of woman you've brought to Circle Z. I wouldn't blame you if you asked me to leave." Samuel considered his words carefully. "My father was a drunk who abandoned my mother when I was 8. She worked herself to death trying to support us. I've been on my own since I was 14, and I've done things I'm not proud of to survive. Out here, we don't judge people by their worst mistakes, Eliza. We judge them by what they do today and tomorrow." She looked up, surprise and something like hope in her expression. "Even fallen women, especially those who have fallen then gotten back up again." He held her gaze steadily. "The way I see it, that banker is the one who should be ashamed, not you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. "Thank you for saying that, even if you're just being kind. I'm not known for empty kindness, Miss O'Malley. Ask any of my cowboys who have felt the sharp edge of my tongue when they slack off." His attempt at lightening the moment worked. A small smile returned to her lips. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned you're quite the taskmaster. Had to be. Didn't have the advantage of being the owner's son. Everything I've earned has been through work and proving myself." He set his empty cup aside. "Not so different from what you're doing now." She considered this, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps we're not so different after all." The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it pleased him. In the silvery moonlight, with her guard lowered and her secrets shared, Eliza looked younger, unburdened like the woman she might have been if life had been kinder. Samuel was suddenly very aware of how alone they were on the porch, how intimate their conversation had become. A strange tension hummed between them, neither entirely comfortable nor unwelcome. He stood before he could do something foolish, like reach for her hand, or, worse yet, pull her into his arms to comfort her in a way that would surely be misinterpreted. "It's getting late," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You should get some rest. Mrs. Henderson won't go easy on you just because you had a late night talking to the foreman." Eliza rose as well, clutching her shawl around her shoulders. "No, I don't imagine she would." "Thank you for listening, Samuel. It's been a long time since anyone has." "Anytime," he replied, meaning it more than he should. She hesitated, then reached out to briefly touch his arm, a fleeting contact that nonetheless sent warmth spreading through him. "Good night." He watched her disappear into the house, wondering what it was about Eliza O'Malley that had gotten under his skin so quickly. Samuel had known plenty of beautiful women in his 30 years, had even fancied himself in love once or twice. But none had affected him quite like this quiet, resilient Easterner with her secrets and her sorrow. "Dangerous territory, Zimmerman," he muttered to himself as he headed toward his own quarters in a small cabin near the bunkhouse. Getting involved with a woman working under his supervision was asking for trouble, especially one with a past as complicated as Eliza's. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't help but replay their conversation, the trust she'd shown in sharing her story, the way the moonlight had touched her face. Samuel had always prided himself on his practicality, his clear-headed approach to life's challenges. Now, for the first time in years, he found himself dreaming of possibilities that had nothing to do with practicality at all. The following weeks saw a subtle shift in their relationship. Nothing inappropriate. Samuel was too conscious of his position, and Eliza too guarded for that, but a deepening friendship that neither could deny. They would often find themselves on the porch after supper, talking about books she'd read or places he'd seen, sharing bits of their pasts in careful measures. He learned she was the youngest of 3 daughters, that she had a talent for drawing that her practical father had discouraged, that she could recite poetry from memory when the mood struck her. She discovered his secret fondness for dime novels, his dreams of someday having his own small ranch, the fact that despite his rough exterior, he had once nursed an orphaned fawn back to health. These exchanges became a private ritual, separate from the daily business of the ranch. During working hours, they maintained a professional distance, she deferential to his position, he respectful of her role in the household. But in those evening conversations, they met as equals, 2 people finding unexpected connection in a place where neither had expected it. The ranch hands noticed, of course. Cowboys were more observant than most gave them credit for, especially when it came to the boss's business. Whispers and knowing glances followed Samuel, but no one dared comment directly, at least not where he might hear. Mrs. Henderson was less subtle. "You're spending an awful lot of time making sure that girl is settling in," she remarked one morning as Samuel lingered over breakfast longer than usual. "Must be the most thorough employee orientation in Circle Z history." He felt heat rise in his neck. "Just being hospitable, Mrs. Henderson." "Miss O'Malley's had a rough time of it. Hum." The old woman's tone made it clear she wasn't fooled. "Well, you could do worse. At least she knows how to properly iron a shirt, which is more than I can say for that widow from Alamogordo you were sweet on last year." "I wasn't," Samuel began to protest, then sighed. "Don't you have biscuits to make or something?" Mrs. Henderson cackled as she returned to her work, leaving him to wonder just how transparent his feelings had become. The test of their newfound understanding came sooner than either expected. In early August, a month after Eliza's arrival, Mr. Hayes sent word that he would be returning to inspect the ranch, bringing with him several potential investors from back east. The main house erupted into frantic preparation, floors polished to a shine, silver buffed, best linens aired, menus planned for elaborate dinners. Eliza threw herself into the work with a determination that impressed even Mrs. Henderson, who had taken to calling her girl with gruff affection rather than disdain. But Samuel noticed the strain around her eyes, the way her smile grew tight at the mention of Eastern businessmen. He found her in the pantry the day before Hayes's expected arrival, counting preserves with such intense focus that she didn't hear him approach. "Eliza, are you all right?" she startled, nearly dropping the jar in her hands. "Samuel, I didn't hear you come in." "Sorry, didn't mean to frighten you." He stepped closer, noting the pallor beneath her usually healthy complexion. "You've been working yourself to exhaustion. Mrs. Henderson says you were up past midnight polishing silver. Everything needs to be perfect for Mr. Hayes and his guests." She returned to counting jars, her movements sharp, controlled. "Mrs. Henderson says he expects the highest standards. Yes, but he doesn't expect his staff to work themselves into collapse." He gently took the jar from her hands, forcing her to look at him. "What's really troubling you, Eliza?" She hesitated, then sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Mr. Hayes is bringing investors from Boston. I'm afraid someone might recognize me or my name. The scandal was only a year ago." Her eyes met his, vulnerable in a way he rarely saw. "I can't face that again, Samuel. I can't lose this place too." Understanding dawned. "You're worried they'll tell Hayes about your past." She nodded miserably. "And then he'll dismiss me. After all, what respectable ranch wants a woman of questionable virtue working in the main house?" Samuel felt a surge of protectiveness. "That won't happen. You can't know that. I know Theodore Hayes. He values competence above all else. And even if one of these men does recognize you, which is unlikely, Hayes won't care about some Eastern scandal as long as his ledgers are kept properly and his shirts are starched to his liking." She didn't look convinced. "People care about appearances, Samuel. Especially wealthy men with reputations to protect. Then we'll make sure they have nothing to gossip about." He squeezed her hands reassuringly. "For the next few days, you'll be assigned to the office. You can update the accounts, organize correspondence, handle the business matters that Hayes always complains I neglect. You won't need to serve at dinner or be present when they are touring the house." Relief flooded her face. "You would do that. Consider it done." He released her hands, suddenly aware of how long he'd been holding them. "And Eliza, if anyone does recognize you and makes trouble, they'll have me to answer to. I promise you that." The smile she gave him then was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, warm, radiant, full of promise. "Thank you, Samuel. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't met you that day in Fort Stanton." "You'd have been fine," he said gruffly, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." "Perhaps," she conceded. "But I'm glad I didn't have to find out alone." Their eyes held for a moment too long, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Samuel cleared his throat, taking a step back. "I should let you finish your inventory, but promise me you'll get some rest tonight." "I promise," she said softly. He nodded, then left before he could do something impulsive like pull her into his arms, a gesture that grew harder to resist with each passing day. Theodore Hayes arrived the following afternoon with his Eastern guests in tow, 3 prosperous-looking gentlemen in city clothes that appeared ridiculously formal against the backdrop of the New Mexico landscape. As Samuel had arranged, Eliza remained sequestered in the ranch office, well away from the main entertaining areas. The first day passed without incident. Hayes was his usual demanding self, inspecting every aspect of ranch operations while entertaining his guests with tales of frontier adventure that Samuel knew were largely exaggerated. The visitors seemed suitably impressed by both the size of the operation and Hayes's colorful narration. It was during the second evening's dinner that trouble found them. Samuel, invited to join the meal to discuss cattle prices, was seated at Hayes's right hand when one of the visitors, Harrington, a silver-haired banker from New York, mentioned a connection to Boston financial circles. "Reminds me of that scandal last year with Blackburn at First Boston Trust," Harrington said, chuckling over his wine. "Respectable banker caught with his mistress, some desperate spinster who thought she could trap him into marriage with a phantom pregnancy. Wife caught them together at their summer home. Quite the talk of Boston society for months." Samuel's hand tightened around his fork. "Sounds like common gossip to me," he said, keeping his voice neutral with effort. Harrington shook his head. "Oh, the affair was real enough. Edward Blackburn was nearly ruined by it, had to be bailed out by his father-in-law. The woman was named in the papers, completely disgraced. O'Malley, I believe. Elizabeth or Eleanor." "Eliza," came a quiet voice from the doorway. Samuel's head snapped up. Eliza stood there, papers in hand, her face pale but composed. She must have come to deliver the accounts Hayes had requested earlier, only to walk into her worst fear. "Eliza O'Malley," she continued, stepping into the room with a dignity that made Samuel's chest ache. "And while we're correcting the record, Mr. Harrington, there was no phantom pregnancy. I lost a very real child during the scandal your friend's wife so carefully orchestrated." Silence fell over the dining room. Hayes looked between Eliza and his guest with raised eyebrows, while the other visitors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Harrington sputtered, wine sloshing in his glass. "Well, I never. How dare you address me in such a manner, young woman? Theodore, is this the sort of help you employ out here in the wilderness?" Before Hayes could respond, Samuel stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Miss O'Malley is our housekeeper's assistant and bookkeeper. She's also a lady deserving of respect, unlike those who spread malicious gossip about matters they know nothing about." "Zimmerman," Hayes cautioned, but Samuel was beyond heeding warnings. "No, sir, this needs saying. I don't know what happened in Boston beyond what Miss O'Malley has told me, but I do know this: she's worked harder than anyone on this ranch since she arrived. She's faced prejudice and cruelty with more grace than most men would manage. And she deserves better than to have her past paraded for entertainment over dinner." Hayes studied Samuel's face, then Eliza's, understanding dawning in his shrewd eyes. "I see," he said slowly. "Well, this is certainly unexpected." "I apologize for the interruption, Mr. Hayes," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the tremor Samuel could see in her hands. "I came to deliver the quarterly accounts you requested. I'll leave them here and withdraw." "No need, Miss O'Malley." Hayes waved a hand dismissively at Harrington, who was still sputtering indignantly. "Albert here was just illustrating why I prefer the West to Eastern society. Too much concern with other people's business, not enough attention to one's own." Harrington's face reddened. "I don't have to sit here and be insulted by a cowman and his fallen woman." The words hung in the air like gunsmoke. Samuel took a step toward Harrington, fists clenched, but Eliza's voice stopped him. "You're right, Mr. Harrington. You don't have to sit here." She placed the account books carefully on the sideboard. "But I am not his woman, fallen or otherwise. I am my own person who made a mistake, paid for it dearly, and has worked every day since to rebuild my life with dignity. Can you say the same about your friend Edward, who lied to his wife, lied to me, and then abandoned me to face the consequences alone?" The quiet strength in her voice silenced everyone in the room. Even Hayes, not known for his progressive views on women, looked impressed. "Well said, Miss O'Malley," he finally remarked. "I always did think Blackburn was a spineless weasel, banking credentials notwithstanding." He turned to Harrington. "Albert, I suggest you reconsider your tone in my house. Miss O'Malley's past is her own business and her present employment is mine. I don't recall asking for your opinion on either matter." Harrington looked as if he might argue further, then thought better of it. The other two investors were studiously examining their dinner plates, clearly wishing to be elsewhere. "If you'll excuse me," Eliza said, inclining her head slightly. "I have work to finish." "Of course," Hayes nodded. "And Miss O'Malley, those quarterly reports are the most comprehensible I've seen in years. Zimmerman's chicken scratch always gave me a headache." It was a small gesture, but the meaning was clear. Hayes was publicly acknowledging her value to the ranch. Past scandal be damned. A faint smile touched Eliza's lips before she withdrew, her head held high. Samuel watched her go, pride and something deeper swelling in his chest. When he turned back to the table, he found Hayes watching him with knowing eyes. "Sit down, Zimmerman," the ranch owner said mildly, "before you do something stupid like punch my investor in his overpriced teeth." Samuel resumed his seat, though his appetite had vanished. The remainder of the dinner passed in strained conversation about cattle prices and water rights, topics safely distant from Boston scandals and disgraced women. Later that night, after the guests had retired, Hayes summoned Samuel to his study. The older man was enjoying a cigar, a glass of whiskey at his elbow. "That was quite a display at dinner," Hayes remarked, offering Samuel a glass which he declined. "Not like you to lose your composure, Zimmerman." "I apologize if I overstepped, sir. Did I say that?" Hayes took a contemplative puff of his cigar. "Miss O'Malley, she's been here how long?" "About a month, sir. And in that time, she's reorganized my household accounts, brought Mrs. Henderson to heel, and apparently captured the undivided loyalty of my foreman." Hayes tapped ash into a tray. "Impressive for a woman who arrived with nothing but shame, as our friend Harrington so delicately put it." Samuel stiffened. "Sir, if you're suggesting—" "Oh, calm down, Zimmerman. I'm not suggesting anything untoward. In fact, I'm suggesting the opposite." Hayes leaned forward, fixing Samuel with a penetrating stare. "You're in love with her, aren't you?" The blunt question caught Samuel off guard. That's not we haven't, save your stammering. I didn't become a wealthy man by being unobservant." Hayes sipped his whiskey. "The question is, what do you intend to do about it?" Samuel ran a hand through his hair, momentarily at a loss. "I hadn't thought that far ahead, sir." "Then start thinking. A woman like that won't wait around forever, scandal or no scandal." Hayes stubbed out his cigar. "You've been a good foreman, Zimmerman, best I've had. But I've seen the way you look at that piece of land by the creek, the one we talked about selling to you one day. You want roots, a place of your own. And unless I'm greatly mistaken, you want her there with you." Samuel couldn't deny it. The vision Hayes described had been taking shape in his mind. For weeks, a small house by the creek, Eliza by his side, perhaps children someday. It seemed both impossible and the only future he could imagine wanting. "She deserves better than a rough cowboy with nothing to his name," he finally said. Hayes snorted. "From what I gather, she's had better in the form of a wealthy, educated Eastern gentleman, and he nearly destroyed her. Maybe what she deserves is an honest man who sees her for who she is, not what society labeled her." The words struck home, resonating with thoughts Samuel had barely allowed himself to acknowledge. "Think about it," Hayes continued, rising to signal the end of their conversation. "But don't think too long. Life's shorter than we like to believe, Zimmerman. I learned that the hard way." Samuel nodded, knowing Hayes was referring to his late wife, taken by influenza before they'd had children. It was the closest the usually stoic rancher ever came to personal advice. "Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. Just don't make a mess of it. I'd hate to lose both my foreman and my bookkeeper because you couldn't sort out your personal affairs." Hayes's gruff tone couldn't quite hide the genuine concern beneath. Samuel left the study with his thoughts in turmoil. Hayes was right. He had fallen in love with Eliza O'Malley. Probably from the first moment he saw her standing alone against the judgment of an entire town. But loving her and acting on that love were very different matters. After everything she'd endured, the last thing he wanted was to add to her burden with unwanted attentions. He needed to know if she could possibly return his feelings. And for that, he needed time and the right moment, neither of which seemed likely with Hayes and his investors still in residence. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The following morning, Hayes announced that business in Santa Fe required his immediate attention. He and his guests would be departing after breakfast, cutting their visit short by several days. Harrington's developed a sudden desire to see the territorial capital, Hayes told Samuel with a knowing smirk. Nothing at all to do with feeling uncomfortable after last night's dinner, I'm sure. Samuel hid his relief. Safe travels, sir. After seeing Hayes and the investors off, the ranch settled back into its normal rhythm. The tension that had permeated the main house dissipated, though Eliza remained quieter than usual, throwing herself into her work with renewed intensity. Samuel gave her space, unsure how to bridge the gap created by the previous night's revelations. It wasn't until evening that he found her in her usual spot on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "May I join you?" he asked, hesitating at the top of the steps. She glanced up, a small smile touching her lips. "Of course." He sat beside her, close enough to talk privately but not so close as to presume. For a while they simply watched the sun's descent in companionable silence. "You didn't have to defend me last night," she finally said, her voice soft, "but I'm grateful that you did. I only spoke the truth. Still, it can't have been comfortable challenging your employer's guess that way." She turned to look at him directly. "I hope I haven't caused problems between you and Mr. Hayes." Samuel shook his head. "Hayes respects backbone more than he respects money. If anything, I think he was impressed. With you or with me." There was a hint of teasing in her tone that eased some of the tension between them. "Both of us, I'd wager." He hesitated, then added, "He thinks highly of you, Eliza. Said your bookkeeping makes mine look like chicken scratch." She laughed softly. "Well, your talents clearly lie elsewhere. I've seen you gentle a wild horse that everyone else was ready to shoot." "I could never do that." "We all have our strengths," he agreed, pleased by her observation. Few people noticed the patience he took with difficult animals, the way he preferred rehabilitation to replacement. Another comfortable silence fell between them as the last rays of sunlight faded and stars began to appear. In the distance, coyotes began their nightly serenade, a sound that had frightened Eliza when she first arrived, but now seemed to comfort her. "I've been thinking," Samuel said carefully, "about what happens next." She glanced at him, questioning. "Next? Hayes mentioned selling me that piece of land by the creek, the one with the cottonwoods. I've been saving for years, and I'm close to having enough for a down payment." He paused, gathering his courage. "I thought I might build a house there, something small to start with but solid." "Your own ranch," she said, understanding in her voice. "You'd be good at that, Samuel. You have a gift for nurturing things, making them thrive." The perfect opening presented itself, and he took it before he could lose his nerve. A ranch needs more than one person to run it properly. It needs a family. Eliza went very still beside him. "Samuel, I'm not Edward Blackburn," he said quickly, needing her to understand. "I don't have fancy words or wealth to offer, but I have honest work, a piece of land that could be something beautiful and—" He took a deep breath. "And a heart that's yours if you want it." She stared at him, her eyes wide in the gathering darkness. Are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking if you could see a future here, not as a housekeeper's assistant but as a rancher's wife, as my wife. He reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. I love you, Eliza O'Malley. I think I have since that first day in Fort Stanton, when you faced down the entire town with nothing but dignity and courage. Tears filled her eyes, reflecting the starlight. After everything you know about me, about my past. Your past is part of what made you the woman you are, and I love every part of you. He squeezed her hand. The question is whether you could love a man like me. I'm not educated like the gentleman you knew back east. I have rough edges that no amount of civilizing will smooth away. Oh, Samuel. Her voice was thick with emotion. Your edges are exactly what make you real, what make you honest. Edward was all smooth surfaces hiding a hollow core. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his weather-roughened skin. I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself, but I've been falling in love with you since you stood up for a stranger when no one else would. Joy surged through him, bright and overwhelming. Is that a yes? It's a yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I want to build a life with you by that creek with the cottonwoods. Samuel didn't remember moving, but suddenly she was in his arms, and he was kissing her with all the longing that had built over weeks of careful distance and respectful restraint. Eliza responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck, her body soft and warm against his. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. I should have done that weeks ago. She laughed, the sound light and free in a way he'd never heard before. Mrs. Henderson would have had your hide. She's very particular about proper courtship, speaking of which. He reluctantly released her, though he kept hold of her hand. I should do this properly. He dropped to one knee before her, looking up into her beloved face. Eliza O'Malley, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Yes, Samuel Zimmerman, she said, her smile radiant in the moonlight. With all my heart, yes. He rose to kiss her again, sealing their promise beneath the vast New Mexico sky, with the mountains as their witnesses and the future stretching before them like an unopened book. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Hayes, returned from Santa Fe, gave Eliza away with surprising solemnity, while Mrs. Henderson sniffled into her handkerchief despite her insistence that she was just bothered by the dust. The ranch hands constructed an arbor of cottonwood branches by the creek where Samuel planned to build their home, and Reverend Parker from Fort Stanton officiated. Eliza wore a new dress of pale blue silk, ordered specially from Santa Fe Hayes's wedding gift, though he gruffly denied any sentimentality when Samuel thanked him. Can't have my foreman's wife looking like a poor relation at her own wedding, was all he would say. As they spoke their vows beneath the rustling cottonwoods, Samuel marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a chance encounter on a dusty street to a love that had overcome scandal, prejudice, and the wounds of the past. I, Samuel, take you, Eliza, to be my lawfully wedded wife, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion tightening his throat. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. Eliza's eyes shone with unshed tears as she repeated the vows, her voice clear and sure. I, Eliza, take you, Samuel, to be my lawfully wedded husband. When Reverend Parker pronounced them man and wife, the assembled ranch hands and neighbors erupted in cheers and whistles. Samuel pulled his bride into his arms for a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and understanding, of seeing past surfaces to the truth within. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing, food and drink flowing freely. Hayes had spared no expense, bringing in a fiddler from Santa Fe and enough whiskey to float a riverboat. Even Mrs. Henderson unbent enough to dance a reel with one of the older ranch hands, her usual severity softened by the occasion. As the party continued around them, Samuel led Eliza away from the crowd, down to the quiet spot by the creek where their home would stand. "Are you happy, Mrs. Zimmerman?" he asked, still marveling at the right to call her by his name. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she answered, leaning into his embrace. "You remember that first day when I arrived in Fort Stanton? How could I forget? You looked like you were facing a firing squad instead of a dusty frontier town." She smiled at the memory. "I was so certain my life was over, that I would never find peace or happiness again. I thought shame would follow me forever." She turned in his arms to face him. "But you saw something else. You saw me, not what had happened to me, not what others said about me, just me. I saw the most courageous woman I'd ever met," he said simply. "Still do." In the moonlight, with the sound of the creek murmuring beside them and distant music floating on the night air, Eliza stood on tiptoe to kiss her husband. "Thank you for seeing the woman within," she whispered against his lips. "Thank you for letting me," he replied, holding her close as if he might never let go. The house by the creek took shape over the following months, a sturdy structure of local stone and timber, with wide windows to catch the mountain light, and a deep porch where they could watch the sunset together. Samuel worked on it whenever he could spare time from his duties at the Circle Z, often joined by off-duty ranch hands happy to help in exchange for Eliza's cooking. By the time winter settled over the mountains, they had moved into their new home. It wasn't large or grand like the houses Eliza had known in Boston, but it was theirs, built with love and care, every beam and board representing their shared future. On Christmas Eve, as snow dusted the landscape outside their windows and a fire crackled in the hearth they'd built together, Eliza gave Samuel her gift news that they would be welcoming a child in the summer. "Are you certain?" he asked, joy and concern mingling in his expression as he remembered what she had lost before. "The doctor in Fort Stanton confirmed it yesterday," she said, taking his hand and placing it over her still flat stomach. "I know there are no guarantees, Samuel, but I believe this child will be strong like his father." "Or stubborn like his mother," he countered, drawing her into a gentle embrace. "Either way, this baby will be loved," she said softly. "So completely loved." In July of 1879, their son was born, Thomas Theodore Zimmerman, named for Samuel's father and, somewhat to everyone's surprise, for Theodore Hayes, who accepted the honor with uncharacteristic emotion. "Never thought I'd have a namesake," the gruff rancher admitted when he came to visit the infant. "Especially not one this handsome. Must take after his mother." Samuel couldn't argue with that assessment. Little Thomas had Eliza's green eyes and the same determined chin that had faced down Boston society and Fort Stanton prejudice with equal courage. As summer turned to fall and fall gave way to another winter, the Zimmerman ranch prospered. Samuel gradually reduced his duties at Circle Z, focusing more on his own growing operation. Hayes, recognizing his foreman's divided loyalties, finally proposed a solution. "I'm getting too old for this wilderness," he announced one day, appearing unexpectedly at their doorstep. "Thinking of spending more time in Denver, maybe even back east." "You'll never leave the Circle Z permanently," Samuel said, knowing how deeply Hayes loved the land he'd built. "No, probably not. Which is why I need someone to run it in my absence, someone who knows the operation inside and out." Hayes fixed Samuel with a steady gaze. "I'm proposing a partnership, Zimmerman. You manage both ranches, take a percentage of Circle Z profits in addition to your own place." When I finally kick the bucket, which won't be for many years, mind you, you'll have first option to buy the whole spread." It was more than Samuel had ever dreamed possible: security for his family, a future for his son, recognition of all his years of hard work. "I don't know what to say, sir." "Say yes, you fool." Hayes clapped him on the shoulder. "Besides, your wife still keeps the best books in the territory. I'd be a poor businessman to let that talent go elsewhere." The arrangement worked better than anyone might have expected. With Hayes spending more time in Denver, Samuel took full control of both ranches, implementing innovations that increased productivity while preserving the land for future generations. Eliza managed the financial side of both operations, her Boston education proving invaluable in navigating the increasingly complex business of cattle ranching in the modernizing West. In 1881, their family grew again with the birth of their daughter, Sarah Grace, a tiny, fierce thing with Samuel's dark hair, and what Mrs. Henderson declared was the most stubborn expression I've ever seen on a newborn. Life wasn't without challenges. Drought threatened their herds one year, while heavy snows isolated them for weeks the next. There were disputes with neighboring ranchers over water rights, problems with cattle rustlers, and the constant struggle of frontier life. But through it all, Samuel and Eliza faced each challenge together, their love deepening with shared triumphs and hardships. The shame that had once defined Eliza's existence faded into a distant memory, replaced by the respect she earned as Mrs. Zimmerman rancher's wife, astute businesswoman, devoted mother. 5 years after their wedding, Eliza received a letter postmarked from Boston. She recognized the handwriting immediately, though she hadn't seen it in years. "It's from my sister," she told Samuel that evening as they sat on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. Thomas, now 5, was showing 3-year-old Sarah how to lasso a fence post, both laughing in the golden afternoon light. Catherine hasn't written since. She didn't need to finish. Her family's rejection had been total and devastating. "What does she want?" Samuel asked, protective as always. "To reconnect." Eliza unfolded the letter again. "She says she's regretted her silence for years. That she's followed my life through mutual acquaintances who knew I'd settled in New Mexico. She asks if she might visit, meet her niece and nephew." Samuel studied his wife's face, reading the conflict there. "Do you want to see her?" "I don't know," Eliza admitted. "Part of me still feels the hurt of being abandoned when I needed my family most. But another part." She looked at their children, then back at the letter. "Family is precious, Samuel. I don't want Thomas and Sarah to grow up without knowing their aunt, their cousins." He took her hand, his touch as reassuring now as it had been that first day in Fort Stanton. "Then write to her. Invite her to visit. If it goes well, wonderful. If not, we'll face that together too." Eliza nodded, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "When did you become so wise?" "Must be all that time spent listening to my brilliant wife," he replied with a smile, pressing a kiss to her temple. Catherine's visit, the following spring, was initially awkward, years of silence creating a barrier between the sisters. But the genuine warmth of the Zimmerman home and the irresistible charm of Thomas and Sarah gradually thawed the frost of old hurts. "He loves you very much," Catherine observed on the 3rd day of her visit, watching as Samuel patiently taught Thomas how to gentle a new foal. "I can see why you chose this life." "I never imagined this would be my path," Eliza confessed, "but now I can't imagine any other. You seem complete here." Catherine's voice held a note of wonder. "After everything that happened in Boston, I feared for you." "We all did, even if pride kept us from reaching out. And now I'll return to Boston and tell our parents what they're missing by clinging to old grievances." Their grandchildren are growing up without them, and for what? Because society dictated you should be punished forever for one mistake. Catherine shook her head. The West has changed you, sister, made you stronger. Not the West, Eliza corrected gently. Love did that. Being seen for who I truly am, not what happened to me. By the time Catherine departed, tentative plans had been made for their parents to visit at Christmas, a reconciliation Eliza had once thought impossible. Whether they would come remained to be seen, but the door had been opened. It was enough for now. As the years passed, the Zimmerman Ranch flourished, becoming one of the most respected operations in the territory. When New Mexico achieved statehood in 1912, Samuel was among those invited to the ceremonies in Santa Fe recognition of his contributions to the region's development. Not bad for a rough cowboy with nothing to his name, Eliza teased as she helped him prepare for the journey. I never had nothing, he corrected, drawing her into his arms despite her protests about wrinkling his good suit. I had you. Their children grew tall and strong, Thomas eventually taking over much of the ranching operation while Sarah, to everyone's surprise, went east to attend college, the same women's school her mother had attended decades earlier, though under very different circumstances. Are you sure about this? Eliza had asked when Sarah first proposed the idea. Boston can be unforgiving. I'm not afraid, Mother, Sarah had replied with the quiet confidence that reminded Eliza so much of Samuel. I'm a Zimmerman. We don't run from challenges. And she hadn't. Sarah returned to New Mexico with a degree in business and a determination to modernize the family ranch for the new century. Under her guidance and Thomas's practical knowledge, the Zimmerman holdings expanded further, embracing new techniques while honoring the land that had given their family its second chance. Through it all, Samuel and Eliza remained the heart of the operation partners in every sense, their love a foundation that neither time nor hardship could erode. On their 30th wedding anniversary, they returned to the spot by the creek where they had exchanged their vows, now shaded by cottonwoods that had grown tall and strong, like their love. You ever regret it? Samuel asked as they sat side by side on the bank, hands clasped as naturally as breathing. Coming west, marrying a cowboy instead of going back to Boston society. Eliza looked at him, this man who had seen past her shame to the woman within, who had built a life with her based on respect and understanding, who had given her a family and a home when she thought she'd lost the right to both. Not for a single moment, she said, and kissed him beneath the cottonwoods as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of promise kept.